When Dan invites me to get up here, I almost feel a little selfish because I get to use this as kind of a little bit more of a personal Bible study, if you will, time that I can kind of dive into something a little bit deeper. From my perspective, I feel like any good story has a good beginning, a context to the situation, a middle, and an end, some sort of effect. Call it the lack of artistic mindset that I've got. Maybe it's a little bit more of my simplistic mind, but I think Bill Murray was in a movie when he was in his early career, and the final scene is him whispering something to a woman, and she gets in the car and she takes off, and that's the end of the movie. And I feel like a lot of people would be like, wow, that's excellent ending. It kind of leaves you on the edge of your seat, sort of a thing. That's not so much me. I kind of like a good beginning, middle, and a good end, a good effect. Fortunately, the Bible is full of stories, isn't it? True stories that kind of accomplish two things. One, we learn about us as humans. The second thing that we learn is about God himself and his character. Instead of having a book full of do's and don'ts, a list of things that we have to be doing, things that we need to stay away from, we have a Bible full of these inspired stories to learn from. Instead of him asking us to be a man after his own heart, we have the story of David. Instead of him telling us that we can turn our life around and make a complete 180, we have the story of Paul. And they are very powerful and moving stories. And so with that being said, today I want to revisit a childhood favorite in Daniel chapter 3. And I would like to break it down into your beginning, middle, and end. So you can consider it maybe 3 sermons in one or 1 in 3. But if you'd like to turn over to Daniel 3, that's where we're going to be camped out for this morning. So we're going to set the stage here, and we're going to just start in verse 1. I'm just going to begin reading here. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps and prefects and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon. named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." That's the intro. That's the context to this story. Nebuchadnezzar's a weird guy, because if you recall in chapter 2, after Daniel had interpreted the dream, if you go back to chapter 2, and I believe it's in verse 47, the king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries." However much time, and I tried to look it up, I don't know how much time transpired between that and now. He has obviously forgotten the weight of that statement and now requests that these three men be brought before him. Three men that he had actually appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon at Daniel's recommendation. So what Nebuchadnezzar has done here, he has made a large golden image. He has put it in a place where it would be viewed by many for long distances. And the command goes out to fall down and worship the image when you hear all these instruments play. But not just that, if you don't, you will immediately be thrown into the midst of the furnace. So what happens? The instruments go off, and the Chaldeans, arguably the educated ones of that day, who might have been very similar to the king, who are probably jealous of these Jews who were appointed over the administration, they come and incite the king by reminding him, number one, do you remember what you had asked people to do, what your commandment was? Number two, these are actually Jews who defied you. And number three, you actually appointed these guys to be an administration over some of your territory. So in verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar even gives them a second chance when they're brought before him. So what is their response? What is their response to the one who is probably the most powerful king to rule in the Neo-Babylonian Empire? The man who conquered Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and took the Jews captive in the face of being thrown into the fiery furnace. Verse 16, "O Nebuchadnezzar." It's almost like they had pity on him. Because if you contrast that with how the Chaldeans presented to the king, "O king, live forever," these three almost have pity of what Nebuchadnezzar is asking them to do and what he's threatening them to do. And in verse 16 to 17, "We do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." So let me pose the obvious question. Did their response, their decision, come from that very moment? Did they have to confer with one another to figure out what their response was going to be. Here's my takeaway from the introduction to the story, is that I need to have the heart of these three men, that who in the face of death itself were okay with whatever God chose to do. But there was no way that they were going to compromise their faith in the one true God. It reminds me of what James says in his letter. How can you have faith without some sort of product, some sort of action, some sort of response? The decisions we make and our actions on a daily basis are simply an outpouring of the faith that we have in God and His Spirit within us. The decision that they made in that moment wasn't something that was just born in that moment. That was who they were. And there was nothing that was going to compromise that, even in the face of death itself. It's who we ought to be. And our life should be a reflection of Him. No matter how hard life may get and no matter how tough the decisions may be, we are constantly His image bearers. If there was a song that comes to mind when I was going through this, as these men gave this answer, most notably in verse 18, is it not the song, "It Is Well With My Soul"? I sing that song all the time. I can't tell you 100% confidence that I believe that that's always going to be the case for me. It was for them. It was for them. So my takeaway from the context of this whole story is to give me the heart of these three men, that in the face of adversity, even if it costs me my own life, that I will not compromise my faith. So it brings us to the middle of the story, the actual story itself. Going back to verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loose and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. So that's the story. That's the middle. Nebuchadnezzar becomes so enraged that he heats the furnace 7 times the heat. So the text even says that his valiant warriors from the army were tasked with tying them up. He didn't take any chance with the whole situation and throws the 3 of them in bound. what does Nebuchadnezzar see? Which I think is an important point here because, as you can notice, he witnesses it. This is not a situation where he sent this off to be done somewhere else. He stood by to witness this whole thing. So what does he see? He sees four, one that had the appearance of a son of the gods, and they're walking around. Remember, the text makes a pretty good point to say that these guys were bound by the valiant warriors of the army. He, Nebuchadnezzar, calls them out, and there's no effect on their bodies. The text says, nor was one hair on their head singed. For me, there's two takeaways from this. First, I think there's a lot to learn sometimes about what God doesn't do, just as well as what he does do and when he chooses to do so. From the time that these three men defied the king to the moment that they were thrown into the fire, God could have saved them at any one point of this story. But it was at this precise moment that his divine intervention would accomplish his will. When the king is onlooking, and at the very moment that their lives would be taken, he steps in and saves them in this manner. Think about our lives. Think about our trials. And maybe I'm speaking for myself, which I oftentimes do, but in our humanistic minds, don't we feel like there's an appropriate time that God's going to intervene in this situation? Whatever that might be, he's going to intervene at this time and in this manner, because that's what I'm asking for him to do. In the story, if God had simply removed the three of them from their presence or created a diversion or did it in some other way, I don't think we have the rest of the story as it plays out. So the first takeaway is this. From the middle of this story, I need to understand that God has the bigger picture in mind. That sometimes what I'm asking is for in the moment, and it may not be what he's wanting to accomplish in the future or the bigger picture of my life. He may not intervene in the time and in the way that I need it, but I need to be okay with that because he's accomplishing something much bigger, and that may be tough. And it may not even make sense for us until years in the future, but at least gives us peace knowing that he's got it and that he's in control. But the second takeaway is almost a qualifier of the first. That God didn't simply intervene in this whole situation at the moment that they were thrown into the furnace. True, that was the moment that Nebuchadnezzar probably saw the four of them, but in reality, there was four in the beginning of this story. The three of those men knew it. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't see it. The takeaway is, if I allow him, he is always intervening. He is always working, molding, changing, molding, working in my life. And accompanying me through life because he lives within us. I knew this was going to be hard to say, but maybe I'm speaking for myself. Why is it that I can see him a lot clearer when I'm in the furnace? He's our constant. From beginning to end in this story, there were four there the whole time. It was just that Nebuchadnezzar couldn't see the fourth one until they were actually in the fire. If he lives within us, he's constantly there. And he's constantly working on us, and he's constantly intervening. It reminds me of what David said in Psalms 139. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. Where can I go from your spirit? So that brings us to the end. Back to the story in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. In one moment, you have Nebuchadnezzar so enraged that it distorts his face. And in the very next moment saying, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." He's a bit extreme here with what he says, but I think the point is well made. After seeing what God was able to do, Nebuchadnezzar realized that he and his golden image were powerless against the one true God. He says, "There is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." I don't have much to add to the narrative of this part of the story, but the takeaway for me is huge. Is this not the picture that people need to see in our lives? When we disciple, when we come alongside people and share life with them, this is what they need to see. They need to see God. They shouldn't see a nice, friendly guy whose name is Neil. They need to see this. This has got to be the actual image that they see. They need to see that there's a greater power, a greater purpose that fills our life. Not just during the trials and difficult times, but always. And whoever is observing, whoever it is that we're discipling, whoever it is that we're working with, they need to know that they can be a part of that too. It reminds me of Jesus' prayer that John records in chapter 17 when Jesus says to his Father, "I do not ask on behalf of these alone, but for those also who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, even as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you sent me." Let us not be mistaken that the same God and the same power that saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the same powerful God that softened the heart of a king who ruthlessly, through the three of them, threw them into the fire to watch them burn, that same power, that same God is alive in us today. And this is what people need to see. So that's your beginning, that's your middle, and that's your effect. The beginning, the context of this story for me is that God give us an immovable, unshakable faith that when life's toughest moments come, we do not compromise our faith no matter what the outcome may be, that we may confidently say, "It is well with our soul." The story itself, let us allow God to always intervene in our lives, even if it is not at the time nor in the way that we would desire. In seeing the big picture, may He accomplish His will through us and give us the peace that comes through knowing that. And the final effect, the conclusion, as we live life with others, may they have the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar to see God in us. Let us go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this time that we get to be together as a family to open up your word and to learn more about you and how much you love us. We're thankful for stories like these where we get to learn from faithful men and women, to learn from their examples and how you were able to intervene in their lives. And God, we know that you continue to intervene in our lives, that you live through us because that is what Jesus said. We pray, Father, that we will go out into the world with you and your Spirit living through us, embolden us with your power, and help us to be better disciples of yours. We pray all this through your Son's holy and blessed name. Amen. All right, have a great week.